The morning sun cast long shadows across the sandstone pillars of Meroe as Princess Kandake strode through the royal courtyard, her gold-adorned braids catching the light like captured fire. At 25, she possessed the regal bearing of her royal bloodline and the sharp intellect that had earned her a place as her father's most trusted advisor. The Kingdom of Kush had prospered under her family's rule for 3 generations, its wealth built upon the rich gold mines that dotted the Nubian landscape like jewels embedded in ancient stone. But prosperity had drawn unwanted attention from the north. Reports filtered in daily through merchants and scouts. Roman legions were massing beyond the cataracts, their eagle standards glinting ominously in the desert heat. Emperor Augustus had grown hungry for Nubian gold, and whispers spoke of an impending invasion that would test every alliance Kandake's father, King Pteratakis, had carefully cultivated. As she paused before the great statue of Amun-Ra, Kandake offered a silent prayer for wisdom. The gods had blessed Kush with abundance, but she sensed that darker days lay ahead, days that would require more than divine favor to survive.
The War Council convened in the Hall of Pillars as the day's heat began to wane. Oil lamps flickering against hieroglyph-covered walls that told stories of Kushite victories spanning centuries. King Pteratakis sat upon his throne of ebony and gold, his weathered face grave as he listened to reports from his generals. The Roman governor of Egypt, Petronius, had already begun fortifying positions along the Nile, while advanced scouts reported the movement of auxiliary troops southward through the desert passes. "They seek to strangle our trade routes before they strike," declared General Amani-Shaketo, her scarred hands tracing movements across a map spread before the council. "Cut off our gold shipments to Alexandria, and they weaken us economically before the first sword is drawn." Kandake studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The Romans were methodical in their approach to conquest, bleeding enemies dry through economic warfare before delivering the killing blow. She knew that Kush's survival would depend not just on military might, but on maintaining the delicate web of alliances that kept the kingdom's various noble houses unified. Yet even now, she could see the seeds of division in the worried glances exchanged between the assembled lords, each calculating how best to protect their own interests in the coming storm.
3 days after the War Council, Kandake rode south to the provincial capital of Naga, where Lord Arikanker-Hor governed the richest gold-producing region in all of Kush. The journey took her through villages where farmers still worked their fields with an innocence that would soon be shattered, their lives untouched by the political machinations that threatened to engulf the kingdom. She found the Lord in his counting house, surrounded by scales and ledgers, his fingers stained with the dust of precious metals that had made him one of the wealthiest men in Africa. "Princess," Arikanker-Hor greeted her with a bow that barely concealed his irritation at the interruption. "To what do I owe this unexpected honor?" His tone carried the subtle insolence of a man who believed his gold mines made him indispensable. Kandake had encountered this attitude before among the noble houses. They were quick to enjoy the protection of the crown, but slow to acknowledge their obligations to it. "I come seeking assurance that your warriors will answer the kingdom's call," she replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. The Lord's response was a diplomatic non-answer wrapped in flowery phrases, but Kandake read the truth in his eyes. When the Romans came, Arikanker-Hor would protect his own interests first, even if it meant negotiating privately with the invaders.
The return journey to Meroe proved even more troubling as Kandake stopped at the fortress city of Musawarat. where Lord Kaliut commanded the eastern frontier. Unlike Arikankarora's calculated greed, Kaliut's motivations were rooted in old grievances and wounded pride. His father had been passed over for the throne a generation ago, and that slight had festered like an infected wound, poisoning his loyalty to the royal house with each passing year. "The Romans offer more than conquest, Princess," Kaliut said as they walked along his fortress walls, gesturing toward the desert where enemy scouts had been spotted the previous week. "They speak of partnership, of local rule under imperial protection. Perhaps it is time to consider whether resistance serves Kush better than accommodation." His words were treasonous, yet spoken with the confidence of a man who believed he held cards his opponents hadn't seen. Kandake realized with growing dread that the kingdom's greatest threat might not come from Roman spears, but from the cancer of division growing within its own borders. Some of the noble houses had already begun hedging their bets, sending secret envoys north while publicly proclaiming their loyalty to the crown. The unity that had made Kush strong was crumbling just when it was needed most.
News of the first Roman incursion reached Meroe through a blood-soaked messenger who collapsed at the palace gates, his horse lathered with foam and dust. A reconnaissance force had crossed into Kushite territory near the Second Cataract, probing defenses and testing response times with the methodical precision that marked all Roman military operations. King Terayetekas ordered an immediate counterattack, dispatching his finest cavalry under General Amanishakato to drive back the invaders and capture prisoners for interrogation. The battle was brief but fierce, fought among the rocky outcroppings where the Nile bent eastward toward the desert. The Romans, caught by surprise in a narrow canyon, fought with the disciplined ferocity of professional soldiers, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Kushite forces who knew every stone and shadow of their homeland. When the dust settled, 12 Romans lay dead and 3 were taken prisoner, including their centurion commander, a man whose bearing and equipment marked him as someone of significance. As the captives were brought back to Meroe in chains, Kandake felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The first blood had been drawn, but she knew this skirmish was merely the opening note of a symphony of violence that would soon engulf her kingdom.
The Roman prisoners were housed in the tower cells overlooking the royal courtyard, their quarters comfortable enough to demonstrate Kushite civility while secure enough to prevent escape. Kandake climbed the stone steps to interrogate them personally, knowing that intelligence gathered now might prove crucial in the battles to come. The 2 common soldiers offered little beyond their names and ranks, their training having prepared them to reveal nothing of strategic value even under duress. But the centurion was different. Marcus Quintus Maximus stood as she entered his cell, his bearing proud despite his circumstances, storm-gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings with calculating precision. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with the lean build and calloused hands of a career soldier. When he spoke, his Greek was fluent and cultured, suggesting an education beyond the typical Roman army officer. "Princess Kandake," he said with a respectful nod, "your reputation precedes you, even to the northern provinces." There was something in his voice, a note of genuine respect, rather than the contempt she might have expected from a Roman toward an African princess. Despite herself, Kandake found her curiosity stirred by this unexpected courtesy from an enemy who had every reason to despise his captors.
Over the following days, Kandake found herself returning to the tower more frequently than military necessity required, drawn by conversations that ranged far beyond the tactical information she sought. Marcus proved surprisingly forthcoming about Roman military structure and strategy, perhaps recognizing that such knowledge might serve as currency to purchase better treatment. But their discussions soon wandered into philosophy, history, and the nature of leadership, topics that revealed a depth of learning unusual in a soldier. "You carry a heavy burden for one so young," Marcus observed during one of their sessions, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her unexpectedly self-conscious. "The weight of a crown is difficult enough when times are peaceful." Kandake bristled at what seemed like condescension, but his expression held no mockery, only a kind of weary understanding that suggested he too knew something about impossible responsibilities. "You speak as if you understand," she replied, curious despite her wariness. Marcus smiled sadly and gestured toward the window where the lights of Meroe glittered like earthbound stars. "Command brings its own chains, Princess. Roman or Kushite, the burden is much the same, to balance duty against conscience, necessity against honor. Some weights are universal."
As weeks passed and the Roman captive became a familiar presence in her daily routine, Kandake began to recognize a disturbing truth. She was genuinely beginning to enjoy Marcus's company. Their conversations had evolved from interrogation to intellectual discourse, touching on subjects she rarely discussed even with her closest advisors. He possessed a perspective shaped by travels across the Mediterranean world, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Syria, and his observations about different cultures and systems of government challenged her assumptions about the world beyond Kush's borders. But it was more than mere intellectual stimulation that drew her back to the tower. There was something in Marcus's manner, a combination of strength and vulnerability that spoke to the loneliness of command she had carried since childhood. When he listened to her concerns about unifying the noble houses or protecting Kush's independence, his attention was complete and his responses thoughtful, free from the political calculations that colored every other conversation in her life. The realization that she was developing feelings for her enemy came like a physical blow, striking at the heart of everything she had been raised to believe about duty and loyalty. Yet even as she recognized the danger, Kandake found herself unable to stay away, drawn by a connection that transcended the boundaries of war and nationality.
King Teratekas summoned his daughter to review the latest intelligence reports from the northern borders, where Roman activity continued to escalate with each passing day. Auxiliary troops had been spotted constructing supply depots along the Nile, while naval units began patrolling the waterways with increasing frequency. The systematic nature of these preparations suggested that the full invasion would come with the next flooding season, when the river levels would facilitate rapid movement of troops and equipment. "The Romans have learned from their previous failures in Ethiopia," the king mused, studying detailed maps spread across his war table. "They will not underestimate us as they did the Ethiopians 3 decades ago." Kandake nodded, though her mind was partially occupied with thoughts of her captive centurion, whose insights into Roman military doctrine had proven invaluable in interpreting these intelligence reports. Marcus had explained the Roman preference for deliberate preparation over hasty action, their willingness to spend months or even years setting the stage for a campaign they intended to win decisively. "We must use their caution against them," she suggested, forcing herself to focus on strategic matters. "If they require extensive preparation, then disrupting their supply lines in advanced positions might force them to delay or abandon their plans entirely."
The moon was full when Kandake made her way to the tower for what she told herself would be her final visit with Marcus. The intelligence value of their conversations had largely been exhausted, and she could no longer justify the risk of continued contact with an enemy officer. Yet, as she climbed the familiar stone steps, her heart raced with an anticipation that had nothing to do with military affairs and everything to do with the confusing emotions that had taken root despite her best efforts to suppress them. Marcus seemed to sense something different in her manner as she entered his cell. his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You've come to say farewell," he said quietly, and she was startled by the note of genuine sadness in his voice. "The games of war and interrogation have run their course." For a moment, the careful masks they both wore slipped, revealing the raw emotion beneath. "This cannot continue," Kandake whispered, as much to herself as to him. "You are my enemy, my prisoner, whatever I may feel." She let the words trail off, unable to voice the full truth of her dilemma. Marcus stepped closer, his chains preventing him from reaching her, but his presence filling the small space between them. "I know," he said softly, "but knowing a thing is wrong does not always make the heart obey."
Against all reason and royal protocol, Kandake found herself ordering Marcus's transfer to more comfortable quarters in the palace guest wing, officially justifying the move as necessary for more extensive debriefing sessions. The new chambers offered greater privacy and fewer suspicious eyes, allowing their conversations to continue without the constant reminder of prison bars between them. She told herself this was still about extracting useful intelligence, but the lie grew thinner with each passing day. Their discussions had evolved into something far more personal and dangerous than military strategy. Marcus spoke of his childhood in a small Italian town, of dreams abandoned when his family's fortunes required him to seek advancement through military service. Kandake shared her own struggles with the expectations placed upon a royal daughter, the weight of always being watched and judged by those who saw her as a symbol rather than a person. In the warm glow of oil lamps, with the sounds of the palace distant and muted, they discovered a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. When Marcus finally took her hand as they sat discussing philosophy late one evening, neither pulled away. The touch was electric, charged with weeks of suppressed attraction and the dangerous thrill of crossing forbidden boundaries that could never be uncrossed.
The relationship that blossomed between Kandake and Marcus existed in a bubble of secrecy, sustained by stolen moments and careful deceptions that grew more elaborate with each passing day. They met in hidden alcoves of the palace, in moonlit gardens where the night-blooming jasmine masked their whispered conversations, in ancient chambers beneath the temple complex where archaeological expeditions had uncovered libraries from earlier dynasties. Every encounter was shadowed by the impossibility of their situation. Yet this very impossibility seemed to intensify the connection between them. Marcus proved to be a gentle and thoughtful lover, his warrior's calloused hands surprisingly tender as they explored the geography of desire that had mapped itself between them. Kandake marveled at how completely she could lose herself in his arms, forgetting for precious hours the weight of crown and kingdom that defined every other aspect of her existence. Yet even in their most intimate moments, the specter of war intruded. Roman forces continued to amass along the borders, while within Kush the noble houses grew increasingly restless and divisive. "When this is over," Marcus whispered against her hair one night as they lay entwined in a hidden chamber, "when peace returns." But neither could finish such thoughts, for they both knew that peace might well mean separation, judgment, and the end of everything they had found together. What Kandake did not know was that Marcus had been far more than a simple centurion when he was captured. He was, in fact, a member of the Roman intelligence service, trained in languages and cultural analysis, sent specifically to gather information about Kushite defenses and political divisions. His capture had been unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected. Such risks were inherent in reconnaissance work.
What he had not anticipated was falling genuinely in love with his captor, creating a conflict between duty and emotion that tore at his very soul. The coded messages he managed to send north through a network of Roman sympathizers among the merchant community contained increasingly valuable intelligence about Kushite military capabilities, troop movements, and most crucially, the growing divisions among the noble houses that could be exploited during an invasion. Yet with each report he sent, Marcus felt a piece of his honor die. He was betraying not just a kingdom, but the woman he had come to love with an intensity that surprised him. Late at night, alone in his comfortable prison, he wrestled with impossible choices. His duty to Rome was absolute, drummed into him through years of training and service. But his love for Kandake had become equally absolute, a force that challenged everything he had been taught about loyalty and honor. The war between his heart and his duty was as fierce as any battle he had ever fought, and he was no longer certain which side he wanted to win.
Lord Arikankaro's private chambers in Naga had become an unofficial meeting place for nobles who questioned King Teritakas's ability to protect Kush from Roman invasion. The gatherings were carefully disguised as social visits or business discussions, but their true purpose was to explore alternatives to what many saw as a suicidal policy of resistance. Maps of Roman trade routes covered the walls, along with detailed accounts of territories that had prospered under imperial rule rather than facing destruction through futile resistance. "Look at Gaul," Arikankaror argued to his assembled guests, gesturing toward a scroll that detailed the wealth and development of formerly Celtic lands. The Romans brought roads, aqueducts, law, and order. Yes, they took tribute, but they also brought peace and prosperity. Lord Kaliut nodded agreement, his scarred face grim with determination. "Our gold mines would be more valuable under Roman protection than Kushite isolation. They have the military might to secure our trade routes and the administrative skills to maximize production." Other nobles murmured assent, though some looked uncomfortable with the treasonous direction of the conversation. The seeds of collaboration were taking root, nourished by fear of Roman might and watered by self-interest that trumped loyalty to the crown. Each meeting brought them closer to a decision that would reshape the kingdom's fate, whether King Teritakos approved or not. Roman preparations reached a crescendo as spring floods began to recede, revealing the full extent of imperial military buildup along Kush's northern borders. Scout reports painted a picture of overwhelming force. 6 full legions supported by auxiliary troops, siege engines, and a naval flotilla capable of controlling the Nile's strategic waterways. The Roman commander, General Gaius Petronius, had earned his reputation in campaigns against Germanic tribes, where his methodical approach and ruthless efficiency had crushed rebellions that had defied Rome for decades. In Mur's war room, King Teritakos struggled to find options among increasingly dire possibilities. The kingdom's military forces, while brave and skilled, numbered perhaps 15,000 warriors against a Roman invasion force nearly twice that size. Worse, intelligence suggested that several noble houses were wavering in their loyalty, their private armies potentially unavailable when the kingdom needed them most. "We cannot match them in open battle," General Ammonishakis stated bluntly, her weathered face reflecting the grim mathematics of war. "Our only hope lies in making conquest so costly that they abandon their ambitions." Kandake studied the maps with growing desperation, her military training warring with the personal knowledge she had gained from Marcus about Roman determination and resources. The Romans did not abandon campaigns lightly,
and Petronius was known for his persistence. Kush was facing not just invasion, but potential annihilation.
The strain of maintaining her secret relationship while preparing for war began to take its toll on Kandake's health and judgment. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, and courtiers whispered about the princess's increasingly erratic behavior, disappearing for hours without explanation, snapping at advisors who had served faithfully for years, and displaying a distracted air during crucial strategic meetings. Only her childhood friend, Marin, now serving as captain of her personal guard, dared to voice concerns directly. "Something troubles you beyond military matters, Princess," Marin observed as they walked through the palace gardens at dawn, his loyal face creased with worry. "You carry burdens that go beyond the weight of command." Kandake wanted desperately to confide in someone about the impossible situation she had created, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain that she had fallen in love with Rome's spy? That every tactical discussion with her father felt like a betrayal of Marcus, while every moment with Marcus was a betrayal of her kingdom? The isolation was crushing, made worse by the growing certainty that she would soon have to choose between love and duty. Both choices led to destruction of her heart or her homeland. For now, she could only nod at Marin's concern and continue carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing day.
Marcus's latest intelligence report contained the most valuable information he had yet obtained. Detailed plans for Kushite defensive strategies, including the location of hidden supply caches and the timetable for evacuating civilians from border regions. The information had come from casual conversations with Kandake, who trusted him completely and spoke freely about military preparations in his presence. As he encoded the message using techniques learned in Roman intelligence training, Marcus felt physically ill at the scope of his betrayal. The coded papyrus was passed to a merchant named Lucius Flavius, who had operated a successful spice trading business in Meroe for several years while secretly serving as a conduit for Roman intelligence. Flavius read the message with growing excitement, recognizing immediately the military value of such detailed strategic intelligence. Within days, the information was speeding north toward Roman army headquarters, where General Petronius would use it to refine his invasion plans and maximize the advantage of surprise. Marcus watched the merchant's departure with a sense of doom, knowing that he had just signed the death warrants of thousands of his lover's people. Yet he could not stop himself from continuing to gather information, driven by a loyalty to Rome that had been forged in childhood and hammered strong through years of military service. The war within his soul was consuming him, but duty still held the upper hand.
As autumn approached and the seasonal rains ended, both sides accelerated their final preparations for the coming conflict. In Roman camps along the northern border, engineers completed the construction of mobile siege towers and assault bridges designed to overcome Kushite fortifications quickly and efficiently. Supply trains stretching for miles brought weapons, armor, food, and medical supplies to support an extended campaign. General Petronius conducted daily briefings with his subordinate commanders, using intelligence reports to plan attacks that would exploit Kushite weaknesses with surgical precision. Meanwhile, in Meroe, King Teretakis issued a formal call to arms, summoning every able-bodied warrior from across the kingdom to defend their homeland against foreign invasion. The response was mixed. Some regions answered immediately with enthusiasm, while others sent smaller contingents than expected or delayed their responses with elaborate excuses. The royal armories emptied as weapons and equipment were distributed to hastily trained militia units,
while blacksmiths worked day and night to produce additional spears, shields, and arrowheads. Kandake threw herself into the preparations with desperate energy, organizing supply lines and defensive positions while trying to ignore the growing certainty that they were preparing for their own destruction. Every strategic discussion reminded her of information she had inadvertently shared with Marcus, making her complicit in whatever disasters were about to unfold.
The night before the Romans were expected to cross into Kushite territory, Kandake slipped away from the final war council to meet Marcus in their secret chamber beneath the temple complex. The air was thick with unspoken words and the weights of impending separation, for both knew that tomorrow would likely end their impossible relationship one way or another. Marcus held her with a desperation that matched her own, as if physical closeness could somehow bridge the growing chasm between them. "Whatever happens," Marcus whispered against her ear, "know that my feelings for you are real. In all the lies and deceptions that surround us, that is the one truth I can offer." Kandake pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent and trying to memorize every detail of this moment. "Promise me you'll survive the coming battle," she pleaded. "Promise me that somewhere in this chaos we might find a way to be together." They both knew such promises were empty given the circumstances, but the need to voice impossible hopes was overwhelming. As dawn approached and duty called them back to their respective roles as enemies, they clung to each other with the fierce intensity of lovers facing execution. Neither could have imagined how prophetic that image would prove to be.
The Roman assault began at dawn with a coordinated attack along multiple fronts designed to overwhelm Kushite defenses through sheer force and superior organization. The main army under General Petronius struck at the fortress of Syene, while secondary forces moved to secure river crossings and cut supply lines to interior strongholds. The methodical precision of the assault reflected months of careful planning, with every Roman unit knowing exactly their objectives and timetables. Siege engines rolled forward under protective cover, while archers provided suppressing fire against Kushite defenders. The defenders fought with the courage of those protecting their homes, but they were outnumbered and out-equipped by professional soldiers who had conquered half the known world. Fortress after fortress fell to Roman engineering and discipline, though not without cost. Kushite warriors fought from every wall and tower, making the invaders pay in blood for every stone captured. By midday, smoke rose from a dozen burning settlements as Roman forces pushed deeper into Kushite territory, their advance flags visible from the walls of Meroe itself. King Teratek watched the approaching disaster from his palace roof, his face etched with the grim acceptance of a ruler who had always known this day might come. The question now was not whether Kush would fall, but how dearly they could make their conquerors pay for victory.
As Roman forces consolidated their initial gains, General Petronius personally reviewed the intelligence reports that had made their rapid success possible. The detailed knowledge of Kushite defensive positions, supply routes, and troop dispositions had allowed his commanders to avoid unnecessary casualties while maximizing the impact of each assault. When he traced the source of this invaluable information back to the captured centurion Marcus, Petronius felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. Such deep penetration of enemy leadership suggested extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck, either of which demanded careful investigation. In Meroe, the pattern of Roman attacks soon made their intelligence advantage obvious to Kushite commanders. Too many supposedly secret positions had been compromised. Too many surprise Roman movements anticipated their defensive responses with uncanny accuracy. General Amenashakato was the first to voice the terrible suspicion that haunted every strategic meeting. They know our plans better than we do. Someone is feeding them information from the highest levels. The accusation hung in the air like poison smoke, turning allies suspicious and making every decision suspect. When investigation revealed that the information could only have come from someone with access to royal war councils, attention inevitably turned to those with knowledge and opportunity. The net was closing around secrets that Kandake had thought safely hidden.
Captain Miren's investigation into the intelligence leaks led him through a maze of palace servants, guards, and officials. Each interview revealing another piece of a puzzle that pointed toward devastating conclusions. The timing of Roman attacks corresponded precisely with strategic discussions in the royal war room, while the accuracy of their intelligence suggested access to the most sensitive military information. When Miren discovered evidence of coded messages passing through the merchant quarter, he began to suspect the terrible truth about his beloved princess's relationship with their Roman captive. The confrontation came during a particularly devastating day of battlefield reports, when news arrived that 3 more fortress cities had fallen to Roman assault. "Princess," Miren said quietly, his weathered face heavy with pain, "I must ask you directly about your relationship with the Roman prisoner." Kandake felt her heart stop as she saw the knowledge in her oldest friend's eyes, the devastating combination of love and duty that would force him to choose between personal loyalty and kingdom safety. "You know," she whispered, and it was not a question. Miren nodded slowly, his soldiers bearing rigid with the weight of what he had to do. "I know that you have been compromised, and I know that your compromise has cost Kushite lives. The question now is what we do with that knowledge."
Confronted with evidence of her unwitting betrayal, Kandake felt her world collapse around her like sandcastles struck by floodwaters. Every casual conversation with Marcus replayed in her memory. Each strategic detail she had shared now revealed as ammunition used against her own people. The magnitude of her failure was crushing, not just as a princess and military leader, but as a person who had allowed love to blind her to treachery that should have been obvious. "How many have died because of my foolishness?" she asked Miren, her voice barely audible. "How many more will die?" Her captain's face was etched with compassion, even as duty demanded harsh truth. "The Romans have pressed their advantage at every turn, Princess. They have known our moves before we made them, anticipated our strategies before we implemented them. The death toll—" He gestured helplessly, unable to quantify the scope of disaster. Kandake understood that she faced an impossible choice: reveal Marcus's duplicity and face the consequences of her own complicity, or continue protecting him while her kingdom bled from the wounds her indiscretion had opened. Love had become a luxury she could no longer afford, no matter how completely it had claimed her heart.
Marcus had watched the Roman invasion unfold with a mixture of professional pride and personal anguish, knowing that his intelligence reports had contributed to every victory his countrymen achieved. From his comfortable quarters in the palace, he could see the smoke rising from burning settlements and hear the distant sounds of battle as defensive lines crumbled under Roman pressure. Each success felt like a dagger thrust into his own heart, for he understood that Kandake was watching the same destruction with the despair of a leader who had failed to protect her people. The summons to appear before King Teretekas came without warning, Roman guards arriving to escort him to the throne room, where the full court had assembled. The atmosphere was electric with suppressed rage and desperate fear. Faces that had once regarded him with polite curiosity, now burning with hatred. Marcus understood immediately that his deception had been discovered, though he wondered how extensive Kandake's knowledge of his betrayal might be. As he was forced to his knees before the Kushite throne, he caught sight of her standing beside her father, her face a mask of royal composure that could not entirely hide the devastation in her eyes. The moment their gazes met, he saw his death sentence written in her expression, along with the deeper wound of love that had been murdered by necessity.
The tribunal convened in the Great Hall of Justice, where carved lions seemed to watch from sandstone pillars as King Teretekas presided over proceedings that would determine the fate of the Roman spy who had infiltrated his family's inner circle. Evidence was presented methodically, coded messages intercepted by loyal guards, testimony from merchants who had served as unwitting couriers, and most damaging of all, detailed comparisons between intelligence shared in royal councils and subsequent Roman military actions. Marcus offered no defense beyond acknowledging his identity as a Roman intelligence officer who had been following his orders and serving his empire. His dignity in the face of certain execution impressed even his enemies, though it could not save his life. What he did not reveal, even under the threat of torture, was the extent of Kandake's unwitting cooperation or the genuine nature of their relationship. That secret he guarded with the same dedication he had once shown to Roman interests, recognizing that protecting her reputation was the only gift he could still offer the woman he had betrayed so completely. "I am a soldier of Rome," he declared simply. "I have done my duty as my training and loyalty demanded. I regret the deception, but not the service." His refusal to implicate Kandake in his activities helped preserve her position, though it could not heal the wounds his betrayal had opened in her heart.
King Teretekas pronounced the death sentence with the heavy authority of a ruler who had seen his kingdom's security shattered by treachery that struck at the very heart of royal power. "Marcus Quintus Maximus," he declared, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom, "you stand convicted of espionage against the crown of Kush, of providing intelligence that has cost the lives of our soldiers and citizens, and of betraying the trust extended to you as a prisoner of war. The penalty for such crimes is death." The execution was scheduled for dawn the following day, to be carried out in the traditional manner by beheading with a ceremonial sword. As guards led Marcus away to a cell in the palace dungeons, Kandake fought to maintain her royal composure while her world crumbled around her. She had stood silent throughout the trial, unable to speak either in his defense or condemnation, without revealing the depth of her own involvement in the disaster that had befallen her kingdom. That night, alone in her chambers, she wept for the man she had loved and the thousands who had died because of her naive trust in that love. The price of her romantic folly would be paid in blood by people who had trusted her to protect them, a burden she would carry for whatever remained of her life.
Unable to sleep as the hours crawled toward dawn and Marcus's execution, Kandake made a decision that defied both protocol and personal safety. Using passages known only to the royal family, she slipped through the palace's hidden corridors to reach the dungeon where her former lover awaited death. The guards at his cell had been given sleeping draughts in their wine, a small mercy she could still arrange without raising suspicions about her motives. Marcus looked up as she entered his cell, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that made her breath catch despite everything that had passed between them. "You should not have come," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Your presence here could be misinterpreted."
Kandake moved closer to the bars that separated them, close enough to touch, but held back by the weight of his betrayal and her own complicity in the disaster it had created. "I had to know," she whispered. "I had to know if any of it was real, if I was anything more than a target to be exploited." The question hung between them like a sword, sharp with the power to inflict wounds that would never heal. Whatever answer he gave would change nothing about tomorrow's execution, but she needed to know whether her heart had been broken by love or merely by skillful manipulation.
Marcus reached through the prison bars to touch Kandake's face with fingers that trembled despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Every moment we shared was real," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of truth too painful to bear. "Every conversation, every touch, every whispered promise in the darkness, real. That is what makes this betrayal so unforgivable. I destroyed something precious and irreplaceable for the sake of duty to an empire that would barely note my passing." Tears ran down both their faces as the full scope of their tragedy became clear. Marcus had been trained to seduce and manipulate, but somewhere in the process, he had fallen genuinely in love with his target, making his betrayal a wound to his own soul as much as hers. "I would undo it all if I could," he whispered. "I would throw away my honor, my loyalty, my very identity to take back the pain I have caused you." Kandake pressed her face against his palm, memorizing the feel of his touch before it was lost forever. "But you cannot," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears. "And tomorrow you die for it, and I live with it, and our people continue to suffer for it. Love was not enough to overcome the divide between us." They held each other through the prison bars until dawn began to lighten the sky, knowing these were the last moments they would ever share. The execution took place in the palace courtyard as the sun cleared the eastern walls, its rays illuminating a scene that would be remembered in Kushite history as a turning point in the war against Rome. Marcus walked to his death with the steady gait of a professional soldier, his head high and his bearing dignified despite the chains that bound his wrists. The assembled crowd watched in silence, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of hatred and respect that his conduct had earned. Kandake stood with the royal family on the palace steps, her face a mask of royal composure that revealed nothing of the agony tearing at her heart. She had insisted on witnessing the execution as both princess and victim of his deception, though every fiber of her being screamed against watching the man she loved die by her father's justice. When the executioner's blade fell with swift finality, she did not flinch or look away, accepting the sight as part of the price she must pay for her failures as a leader. The crowd dispersed quickly after the deed was done, but Kandake remained frozen in place, staring at the blood-stained stones where love and duty had met in final, irrevocable conflict. Marcus was dead, but the intelligence he had provided would continue to kill her people until the war reached its conclusion.
In the days following Marcus's execution, Kandake threw herself into war preparations with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction, working through nights and driving herself to exhaustion in efforts to undo the damage her naive trust had caused. She reorganized defensive positions, changed supply routes that had been compromised, and implemented new communication protocols designed to prevent future intelligence leaks. Her transformation from lovelorn princess to hardened war leader was swift and absolute, forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by guilt that demanded penance through service. The Roman advance continued relentlessly, but their pace slowed as Kandake's new defensive strategies began to take effect.
Supply raids disrupted their logistics, while carefully coordinated retreats drew Roman forces into prepared kill zones where Kushite archers and spearmen could exact a heavy toll. Though still outnumbered and out-equipped, the defenders fought with renewed purpose under leadership that had been purged of sentiment and focused purely on victory through any means necessary. Kandake's personal guards noted the change in her princess with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had become an effective military commander, but at the cost of everything warm and human in her nature. The woman who had laughed and loved seemed to have died with her Roman betrayer, leaving only a coldly efficient instrument of war.
While Kandake struggled to rebuild Kushite defenses against Roman invasion, the conspiracy among the noble houses reached its culmination in a secret meeting at Lord Arakan Karor's estate near the gold mines of Naga. Representatives from 7 of the kingdom's most powerful families gathered under cover of darkness to finalize their plans for accommodation with Rome rather than continued resistance that promised only destruction. "The writing is carved in stone," Arakan Karor declared to his fellow conspirators, unrolling maps that showed Roman territorial gains across the northern provinces. "Terry Takwas leads us toward annihilation through stubborn pride. Better to negotiate surrender while we still have something to bargain with than to fight until nothing remains but ruins and corpses." Lord Kaliut presented detailed terms that Roman envoys had secretly offered. Local rule would be preserved under imperial oversight. Trade routes would be protected and expanded, and the noble houses would retain their wealth and status in exchange for cooperation and regular tribute payments. The offer was seductive, promising prosperity and peace at the cost of independence that many viewed as an abstract concept anyway. By dawn, the conspiracy had transformed into active collaboration, with messengers dispatched to Roman commanders offering to deliver key strongholds in exchange for the promised terms.
News of the noble house's betrayal reached King Teratakis through loyal servants who risked their lives to carry intelligence across enemy lines, arriving just as Roman forces prepared for what they anticipated would be a decisive assault on Meroe itself. The king's face showed no surprise at the news. He had suspected treachery for weeks as defensive positions mysteriously collapsed and supply lines were severed with suspicious precision. Yet having suspicions confirmed brought a weariness that seemed to age him years in moments. "So it ends as it began," he murmured to his assembled war council, "with division among our own people proving more deadly than enemies' spears." General Amana Shakato slammed her fist on the war table, her scarred face twisted with rage at the scope of the betrayal. "Give me 1 legion of loyal troops, and I will see that these traitors share the fate of their Roman allies," she snarled. But Kandake, studying reports of Roman positions and collaborator strongholds, shook her head grimly. "Our strength is too depleted for campaigns of vengeance," she said with cold practicality. "We must focus on what can still be saved, rather than punishing what is already lost." The princess had learned to think like a general rather than a wounded lover, calculating odds and possibilities with ruthless efficiency that would have impressed even her dead Roman betrayer.
The siege of Meroe began with a spectacle designed to break Kushite morale before the first assault waves struck the city's ancient walls. Roman siege engines rolled forward under protective mantlets, while trumpeters announced the presence of General Petronius himself, come to personally oversee the conquest of Kush's capital. Catapults hurled stones and flaming projectiles over the walls, while ballistae sent massive bolts through wooden shutters and bronze-reinforced gates. The methodical destruction was intended as much to terrorize defenders as to breach fortifications. From the palace roof, King Teritek and his family watched their kingdom's death throes with the stoic dignity expected of royal blood facing inevitable defeat. The sight of Roman standards planted on captured towers throughout their territory was painful, but not as painful as seeing the banners of collaborating noble houses flying alongside enemy eagles. Kandake stood beside her father, her armor reflecting the fires that had begun to consume the outer districts, her face showing nothing of the emotions warring within her breast. She had become the sword arm of a dying kingdom, sharpened by betrayal and tempered in the forge of hopeless warfare. Whatever love and softness had once defined her seemed as distant as childhood memories, burned away by necessities that demanded only steel and determination.
As Roman siege towers approached the inner walls of Meroe, Kandake took personal command of the defense, positioning herself where the fighting would be fiercest and the example of royal courage most needed. Her presence on the battlements inspired defenders who had begun to despair, while her tactical skills, honed through painful lessons learned from Roman intelligence advantages, maximized the effectiveness of their limited resources. Oil and stones rained down on Roman assault troops, while Kushite archers sent bronze-tipped arrows into gaps in enemy armor with deadly precision. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, with Roman discipline eventually overwhelming Kushite courage through sheer weight of numbers and superior equipment. Kandake fought with the desperate fury of someone who had already lost everything that mattered, her sword cutting down Roman soldiers who breached the walls, even as more poured through gaps blasted by siege engines. When General Amanishakito fell with a Roman spear through her chest, Kandake took the dead woman's shield and continued fighting, leading by example even as hope died around her. The princess, who had once debated philosophy with Roman lovers, had become a warrior queen, forged in the flames of betrayal and loss, determined to make her enemies pay in blood for every stone of her ancestors' legacy.
The final assault on the royal palace began at dawn on the 4th day of siege, with Roman troops pouring through breached walls and shattered gates like floodwaters through a broken dam. Street by street, room by room, they fought their way toward the throne room, where King Teritek waited with his remaining guards and family members. The sound of battle drew steadily closer as defensive positions collapsed under overwhelming pressure, each fallen barrier bringing Roman victory one step nearer. Kandake fought a desperate running battle through the palace corridors, her small force of loyal guards dwindling with each encounter as they tried to buy time for civilians to reach the underground passages that led to the temple complex. Her armor was dented and blood-stained, her sword notched from striking Roman mail and bronze, but her determination remained unbroken. When Roman soldiers finally burst into the throne room itself, they found the royal family arranged in formal court dress, ready to face death with the dignity their ancestors had shown for 1,000 years. Kandake stood at her father's right hand, her sword still in her grip, though she knew the battle was lost. The war that had begun with love and betrayal was ending in fire and steel, exactly as she had feared it would from the moment Marcus's true nature was revealed. General Petronius entered the conquered throne room with the measured steps of a professional soldier who took no pleasure in victory over such determined opponents, his weathered face showing respect for enemies who had made Rome pay dearly for conquest.
King Tereticus remained seated on his throne of ebony and gold, refusing to acknowledge defeat even as Roman swords surrounded his family and the last defenders lay dead at their feet. The confrontation between conqueror and conquered was conducted with formal courtesy that barely masked the brutal realities of imperial expansion. "Your Majesty," Petronius said with a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and contemptuous, "Rome offers terms for your surrender and the peaceful transition of authority to imperial administration." The terms were surprisingly generous: exile rather than execution for the royal family, preservation of certain cultural practices under Roman oversight, and protection for civilians who submitted peacefully. Kandake listened to the recitation with growing anger, recognizing the same seductive promises that had been offered to the collaborating noble houses. She wanted to reject the terms outright and die fighting beside her father, but practical considerations argued for survival. A living princess in exile might someday return to reclaim her heritage, while a dead one could never serve her people's interests. The choice between honor and pragmatism was as bitter as any she had faced, but the lessons learned from Marcus's betrayal had taught her to choose survival over sentiment.
The negotiations for Kushite surrender took place in the damaged throne room over several days, with Roman scribes recording terms that would formally end the kingdom's independence and integrate its territories into the imperial province system. King Tereticus maintained his dignity throughout the proceedings, though the weight of defeat aged him visibly with each concession extracted by Roman administrators who viewed the conquered kingdom as another asset to be efficiently managed. Kandake participated in the discussions with the cold intelligence that had replaced her former warmth, fighting for every concession that might preserve some vestige of Kushite culture and autonomy under imperial rule. Her knowledge of Roman administrative practices, gained through conversations with Marcus, proved invaluable in understanding which terms were negotiable and which were absolute requirements of imperial policy. The irony was bitter. Intelligence gathered through love and betrayal now served to minimize the consequences of military defeat. When Petronius offered her personal terms, including a comfortable exile in Alexandria and a pension befitting her royal status, she negotiated instead for the right to oversee the transition period and ensure protection for loyal servants who had risked their lives in royal service. The princess who had once dreamed of love had become a pragmatic negotiator who understood that survival required compromise with enemies she despised.
In the aftermath of Meroe's surrender, Roman administrators began the methodical process of converting conquered territory into imperial province, replacing Kushite laws and customs with Roman legal codes and taxation systems. Ancient temples were surveyed for valuable materials and artwork that could be shipped north to adorn Roman villas, while administrative centers were established in former royal residences. The transformation was efficient and thorough, designed to erase Kushite identity and replace it with Roman imperial culture. Yet beneath the surface compliance, seeds of resistance began to germinate in unexpected places. The great temple of Amiens, whose priests had served as advisors to Kushite kings for centuries, became a focal point for those who refused to accept permanent subjugation to foreign rule. Ancient rituals continued in hidden chambers, while coded messages passed between loyal communities scattered across the former kingdom. Kandake, though officially under Roman supervision, found ways to maintain contact with these underground networks through servants and former guards who had chosen loyalty over collaboration. The temple complex, with its maze of corridors and hidden chambers, provided ideal meeting places for those plotting eventual liberation. What the Romans saw as defeated enemies accepting their fate was actually the beginning of a different kind of war,
One fought in shadows and whispers rather than with swords and spears.
Among the Roman officers now occupying Meroe was a young tribune named Lucius Flavius, the same merchant who had served as Marcus's contact for intelligence reports during the siege. His knowledge of the spy network that had helped secure Roman victory earned him promotion and assignment to the administrative staff responsible for integrating Kushite territory into imperial governance. When he encountered Princess Kandake during official proceedings, he recognized her immediately from Marcus's detailed descriptions and felt an unexpected mixture of admiration and guilt. "You are even more remarkable than he described," Flavius said quietly during a private moment, referring to the dead centurion whose intelligence reports had proven so valuable. "Marcus spoke of you often in his final messages, though I doubt you wish to hear such things." Kandake's face showed no emotion at the mention of her former lover's name, though her hands clenched slightly at her sides. The pain of betrayal had been buried beneath layers of practical necessity, but it still lived in her heart like buried coals that could flare to life at the slightest provocation. "The dead cannot speak," she replied coldly, "and the living must focus on survival rather than memory." Yet despite her harsh words, she found herself listening as Flavius described Marcus's final days in Roman custody, his expressions of regret and genuine anguish at the destruction his reports had helped cause. Love might be dead, but its ghost still had power to wound.
3 months after the fall of Meroe, the first organized acts of resistance against Roman rule began to emerge from the underground network that had been quietly forming around the Temple of Amun. Supply convoys disappeared in desert ambushes, tax collectors were found dead in remote villages, and Roman patrols reported increasing incidents of harassment by invisible enemies who struck from concealment and melted away like morning mist. The attacks were carefully coordinated and precisely targeted, suggesting organization and leadership that went beyond random banditry. General Petronius responded with the systematic brutality that had served him well in other pacification campaigns, imposing collective punishments on communities suspected of harboring rebels, while offering substantial rewards for information leading to their capture. Yet the resistance seemed to grow stronger with each harsh measure, drawing support from populations that had initially accepted Roman rule as inevitable. Intelligence reports reaching Roman headquarters spoke of a shadowy leader known only as the Candace, using the ancient title for Kushite queens, whose followers seemed willing to die rather than betray their cause. What the Romans did not yet realize was that their most dangerous enemy was hiding in plain sight, posing as a cooperative member of the conquered royal family while secretly organizing the very rebellion they sought to crush. Kandake had learned valuable lessons about the power of intelligence and deception from her Roman lover, and now she applied those lessons against his countrymen with devastating effectiveness.
The rebellion that grew from Kandake's careful planning took forms the Romans had never encountered in their previous conquests, adapted to the unique geography and culture of the Nubian desert. Instead of massed armies that could be defeated through superior discipline and equipment, the resistance operated in small, highly mobile units that struck without warning and disappeared into landscape they knew better than any foreign invader. Ancient trade routes became supply lines for rebels, while hidden oases served as bases that Roman patrols could never locate. The Temple of Amun proved to be the perfect command center for coordinating resistance activities across the former kingdom. Its labyrinthine passages and chambers provided secure meeting places, while its religious significance made it a natural rallying point for those who refused to accept foreign domination. Priests who had served Kushite kings for generations now served their exiled princess, using networks of communication that stretched across hundreds of miles to coordinate attacks and share intelligence about Roman movements. Kandake found bitter irony in the situation.
She was now using the same techniques Marcus had employed against her, turning Roman confidence in their victory into vulnerability that could be exploited by patient enemies who understood the value of information and timing. The student had become the teacher, and the lessons were written in Roman blood.
Roman retaliation against the growing rebellion was swift and merciless, following patterns established in other provinces where insurgencies had challenged imperial authority. Collective punishments decimated suspected communities, while suspected collaborators faced torture and execution designed to break the will of those who might otherwise support rebel activities. Yet each act of brutality seemed to create new enemies rather than eliminate existing ones, as families who had lost members to Roman justice sought vengeance through the underground networks. Kandake watched the escalating cycle of violence with a mixture of satisfaction and horror, knowing that every Roman death advanced her cause, while every Kushite death weighed on her conscience as the price of resistance leadership. The woman who had once wept over a single Roman's execution now planned operations that would kill dozens of imperial soldiers, her heart gradually hardening into something that would have been unrecognizable to Marcus or even to her former self. War had taught her that sentiment was a luxury leaders could not afford, that victory required sacrifices measured not in individual lives, but in strategic objectives achieved through calculated brutality. The transformation was necessary for survival and eventual liberation, but it came at a personal cost that grew heavier with each passing day.
Tribune Lucius Flavius found himself assigned to the task of hunting down the rebel leader known as the Candace, using his background in intelligence work and knowledge of local conditions gained during his years as a merchant in Meroe. His investigation began with analysis of attack patterns and rebel communications, searching for clues that might reveal the identity and location of the mysterious figure who seemed to anticipate Roman moves with uncanny accuracy. What Flavius discovered gradually filled him with both professional admiration and personal dread. The rebel leader possessed detailed knowledge of Roman military doctrine and administrative procedures that went far beyond what any defeated Kushite should have known. More disturbing still, the intelligence network supporting the rebellion showed sophistication and security that rivaled anything Rome had encountered in other provinces. As the investigation progressed, Flavius began to suspect connections between the current rebellion and the spy network that Marcus had penetrated during his time as a prisoner in the royal palace. The thought that his old friend's lover might be orchestrating the very resistance he was charged with crushing brought a complicated mixture of emotions: respect for her abilities, fear of her effectiveness, and guilt over his own role in the betrayal that had created such a formidable enemy.
The confrontation between Flavius and Kandake came during what appeared to be a routine administrative meeting, when the Roman tribune's careful questioning about security procedures revealed that he suspected her true role in the rebellion. The moment of recognition was electric, charged with the weight of shared knowledge about Marcus and the intelligence network that had once served Rome so effectively. Both understood immediately that their careful game of hunter and prey had reached a decisive moment. "You know," Kandake said quietly, her voice steady despite the danger of exposure. Flavius nodded slowly, his hand resting unconsciously on his sword hilt as he calculated the implications of his discovery. "I know that the woman Marcus loved has become Rome's most dangerous enemy," he replied with grudging admiration. "And I know that exposing you will mean the death of someone he died trying to protect." The weight of that knowledge hung between them like a sword, sharp with the power to destroy lives and reshape the course of the rebellion that had consumed both their peoples in its flames.
The strange partnership that developed between Flavius and Kandake was born from shared guilt over Marcus's death and mutual recognition
of the futility of continued warfare that served neither Roman nor Kushite interests. Flavius had witnessed the brutal efficiency of imperial pacification campaigns and understood that complete suppression of Kushite resistance would require genocidal measures that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Kandake, meanwhile, had seen enough of war's costs to know that continued rebellion would bleed her people white without achieving meaningful liberation. Their secret meetings took place in the same hidden chambers beneath the Temple of Amun, where she had once planned attacks against his countrymen. But now they discussed possibilities for negotiated settlement that might preserve Kushite dignity while satisfying Roman imperial requirements. It was delicate work, complicated by the need to maintain their public roles as conqueror and conquered, while secretly exploring paths toward peace. Marcus would have appreciated the irony, Flavius observed during one of their clandestine conferences. His betrayal created the very situation we now seek to resolve through betrayal of our own sides. Kandake smiled grimly at the observation, recognizing truth in words that would have seemed impossible months earlier, when hatred was the only emotion she could feel toward anything Roman.
Maintaining the deception required extraordinary skill, as both Kandake and Flavius continued their public roles, while secretly working toward goals that neither of their peoples would understand. Kandake still planned and coordinated rebel attacks, but now she selected targets that would cause maximum political impact with minimal civilian casualties, while Flavius fed intelligence to his superiors that was accurate enough to maintain credibility, but delayed enough to allow rebel forces to escape major Roman sweeps. The delicate balance grew more difficult as General Petronius began to suspect that someone within the administration was providing information to the rebels. Security measures tightened around all personnel with access to operational intelligence, while interrogation teams worked to break captured rebels who might reveal details about their command structure. Each day brought new risks of exposure for the unlikely allies, who found themselves walking an increasingly narrow line between loyalty and treason, duty and conscience. "We are betting everything on a future that may never come," Kandake observed during one of their meetings, her voice heavy with the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Perhaps," Flavius replied, "but the alternative is a certainty of continued suffering that serves no one's interests except those who profit from perpetual warfare." The crisis that nearly exposed their collaboration came when a major Roman supply convoy was ambushed, using intelligence that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of military planning. General Petronius launched a comprehensive investigation, employing interrogation techniques that had broken resistance movements across the empire. The net was closing around potential suspects, with Flavius high on the list due to his previous intelligence background and current access to sensitive information. Under intense questioning, Flavius employed skills learned during his years in Roman intelligence service, deflecting suspicion while maintaining his cover as a loyal officer pursuing the rebel leadership. His performance was masterful, combining truth with misdirection in ways that satisfied his investigators while protecting both himself and Kandake from discovery. Yet the experience left him shaken, aware that their secret alliance existed on borrowed time, and that discovery would mean death for both of them. "We must accelerate our timeline," he told Kandake after a particularly close call. "Petronius suspects treachery, but hasn't identified its source. We may have weeks before the investigation closes around us, but we cannot count on months." The pressure was building toward a climax that would either vindicate their risky strategy or destroy them both in spectacular failure. Working through intermediaries who could not be traced back to either of them, Kandake and Flavius began putting together a comprehensive proposal for ending the Kushite rebellion through negotiated settlement that would address the legitimate grievances of both sides. The document was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, offering Rome the substance of imperial control while preserving Kushite symbols and cultural autonomy that would allow their people to accept defeat without complete humiliation. The proposal included provisions for limited self-governance under imperial oversight, preservation of traditional religious practices, integration of Kushite warriors into Roman auxiliary units with their own commanders, and economic development programs that would benefit local populations while serving imperial interests. Most crucially, it offered general amnesty for all participants in the rebellion in exchange for formal submission to Roman authority. "It is the best we can achieve given current circumstances," Kandake admitted as they reviewed the final draft. "My people get to keep their dignity and their gods, while Rome gets their gold and their strategic position. Both sides compromise, but both sides survive." The challenge now would be convincing their respective leaders to consider terms that neither side had originally been willing to accept, a task that would require all their combined skill and influence.
Flavius took the dangerous step of presenting their secret proposal to General Petronius as his own analysis of options for ending the rebellion without resorting to the massive military campaign that would be necessary to crush Kushite resistance completely. He framed the recommendations in terms of Roman interests, emphasizing the costs of continued warfare against the benefits of a negotiated settlement that would achieve imperial objectives more efficiently than prolonged military operations. Petronius received the proposal with the skepticism of a professional soldier who had built his career on decisive military action rather than diplomatic compromise. Yet he was also a pragmatist who understood that extended guerrilla warfare in desert terrain would bleed Roman resources while producing questionable strategic benefits. The general studied the document carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he weighed political realities against military preferences. "These terms are surprisingly generous to the defeated," he observed finally. "One might wonder how we arrived at such detailed understanding of rebel motivations and requirements." The implied suspicion in his words made Flavius's blood run cold, but he maintained his composure while explaining that successful pacification required understanding enemy psychology and cultural imperatives. The interview ended without commitment, but also without arrest, a temporary victory that bought them precious time to implement their desperate gambit. Convincing the rebel leadership to consider a negotiated settlement proved even more challenging than swaying Roman authorities, for Kandake's followers had sacrificed too much to accept anything that resembled surrender to their oppressors. The secret meeting convened in the deepest chambers beneath the Temple of Amun, where oil lamps flickered against walls covered with hieroglyphs that told stories of ancient Kushite victories over foreign invaders. The assembled commanders represented the full spectrum of resistance activities across the former kingdom, from desert raiders who harassed Roman supply lines to urban organizers who coordinated intelligence networks in occupied cities. Their faces showed the wear of months of guerrilla warfare, scarred and weathered by hardships that had forged them into instruments of vengeance against imperial occupation. "You ask us to accept defeat disguised as negotiation," declared Shabaka, whose brother had died in Roman custody. "What honor is there in submitting to those who have murdered our families and defiled our temples?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with the weight of shared grief and unrequited anger. Kandake knew she was asking them to abandon dreams of complete liberation in favor of partial autonomy that might preserve their people's survival. The choice was bitter, but the alternatives were extinction or endless warfare that would consume everything they sought to protect.
Kandake's arguments to the rebel council drew upon every lesson she had learned about the realities of power and the necessities of survival in a world dominated by imperial force. She spoke of the Roman military machine that could replace every legion they destroyed, of the systematic brutality that would follow any major rebel victory, and of the civilian populations who would pay the ultimate price for continued resistance that could not achieve its stated objectives. "We are not surrendering," she insisted, her voice carrying the authority of royal blood and proven leadership. "We are transforming defeat into survival, humiliation into opportunity. Under these terms, our children will grow up knowing their heritage and honoring their ancestors, even if they must also respect Roman law and pay Roman taxes." Her words divided the assembled commanders, some nodding agreement while others stared at her with barely concealed disgust at what they saw as betrayal of everything they had fought to achieve. The debate that followed was fierce and often personal, touching on questions of honor, duty, and the meaning of freedom that had no easy answers. When dawn broke over the temple complex, the council had reached a tentative consensus to explore the proposed terms, though many made it clear they viewed negotiation as a temporary expedient rather than a permanent solution to Roman occupation.
The initial contact between Roman and Kushite negotiators took place at a ruined fortress midway between Meroe and the northern border, chosen for its symbolic neutrality and practical isolation from observers who might interfere with delicate discussions. General Petronius arrived with a small escort and full military honors, while Kandake appeared in her capacity as representative of the former royal house, rather than acknowledging her role as rebel leader. The negotiations proceeded through intermediaries and formal protocols that maintained face for both sides, while exploring substantive issues that might form the basis for comprehensive settlement. Petronius proved to be a more flexible negotiator than his reputation suggested, recognizing that ending the rebellion through diplomacy would enhance his standing with imperial administrators who valued efficiency over military glory. Kandake matched his pragmatism with her own, setting aside personal hatred in favor of terms that might preserve something valuable from the wreckage of her kingdom's independence. Yet beneath the diplomatic courtesy, both sides remained acutely aware that failure would mean renewed warfare on a scale that would dwarf previous conflicts. The stakes were measured not in political advantage, but in the survival of entire populations caught between incompatible visions of justice and order.
The fragile negotiations nearly collapsed when hardline elements from both sides attempted to sabotage the peace process through violence designed to inflame hatred and make compromise impossible. A Roman patrol was ambushed near the negotiation site by rebels who rejected Kandake's authority, while Roman soldiers responded by burning a village suspected of harboring the attackers. The cycle of retaliation threatened to spiral out of control, destroying months of careful diplomatic groundwork. Working together despite the growing crisis, Kandake and Flavius moved quickly to contain the damage through coordinated action that demonstrated their secret alliance to anyone watching carefully. She used her remaining influence to discipline the rogue rebels, while he employed his authority to restrain Roman revenge operations, both walking dangerously close to exposure as they struggled to preserve the peace process. "We are running out of time and credibility," Flavius warned during an emergency meeting in the ruins of an ancient shrine. "Both sides are looking for excuses to return to warfare, and our efforts are creating suspicion about our loyalty to our own peoples." The irony was bitter. Their success in moderating the conflict had made them suspect to the very people they sought to serve, creating a situation where peace itself had become a form of treason.
The investigation into the sabotage attacks eventually led Roman intelligence officers to intercept communications that revealed the existence of secret contacts between their own personnel and rebel leadership. While the intercepted messages did not identify specific individuals, they provided enough evidence to convince General Petronius that someone within his administration was engaged in unauthorized negotiations with enemy forces. The general's response was swift and comprehensive, placing all personnel with access to sensitive information under intensive surveillance, while launching a renewed investigation into possible treasonous activities within Roman ranks. Flavius found himself under particular scrutiny due to his intelligence background and his previous association with Marcus's spy network, while increased security around Kandake made their clandestine meetings increasingly dangerous. "They know someone is working with the rebels," Flavius reported, during what both recognized might be their final secret conference. "Petronius hasn't identified us specifically, but the net is tightening. We may have to abandon our efforts or risk exposure that would doom any possibility of negotiated settlement." The moment of truth was approaching, when their careful deception would either achieve its objectives or destroy them both in spectacular failure.
The truth about Kandake and Flavius's secret alliance emerged in the worst possible way when a captured rebel broke under torture and revealed details about meetings between the Candace and a Roman officer who had provided intelligence to the resistance. The information was fragmentary and confused, but it provided enough clues for General Petronius to piece together the scope of the conspiracy that had been operating under his nose. The confrontation took place in Petronius's headquarters with full military ceremony, as Flavius was formally charged with treason against the empire, while Kandake faced accusations of espionage and continued rebellion despite her apparent cooperation with Roman authorities. The evidence was circumstantial but damning, supported by the general's growing suspicion that the negotiation process itself had been part of an elaborate deception designed to weaken Roman resolve. "You have betrayed everything Rome stands for," Petronius declared to his former subordinate, "while she has betrayed our trust and our mercy. Both of you will face the consequences of treachery that has cost Roman lives and undermined imperial authority." The charges carried mandatory death sentences that could only be avoided through confession and complete cooperation with Roman investigators seeking to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. Rather than face execution as traitors, Kandake and Flavius demanded their right to trial by combat, an ancient Roman tradition that had fallen into disuse but remained technically valid under military law. The request created a legal and political dilemma for General Petronius, who recognized that granting the demand would create a spectacle that might turn martyrs into heroes, while refusing it would suggest Roman fear of defeated enemies. The trial was scheduled to take place in the great amphitheater of Meroe, hastily converted from its original purpose as a venue for royal ceremonies into an arena suited for mortal combat. Kandake would face a champion selected by the Roman administration, while Flavius would fight against his former comrades in a display of justice that was designed to demonstrate imperial fairness while ensuring the desired outcome. The preparations attracted attention from across the occupied territory, as people who had lived through conquest and rebellion gathered to witness what many saw as the final act in the drama that had consumed their homeland. Both defendants spent their final days in preparation, knowing that victory in combat might vindicate their actions, while defeat would end their lives and any hope for the negotiated peace they had sacrificed everything to achieve.
The morning of the trial dawned clear and hot, with crowds filling every available space in the amphitheater, as Romans and Kushites alike came to witness combat that would determine the fate of two people who had dared to challenge the boundaries between enemy and ally. General Petronius presided over the proceedings from the imperial box, his face showing nothing of whatever emotions he might have felt at watching the destruction of individuals whose crime had been seeking peace through unauthorized means. Kandake entered the arena wearing armor that combined Roman military equipment with Kushite royal regalia, creating a visual symbol of the cultural fusion she had attempted to negotiate through diplomatic means. Her opponent was a veteran gladiator imported from Alexandria specifically for this occasion, a professional killer whose skills had been honed through years of arena combat. The fight that followed was brief but fierce, demonstrating the warrior training that had made Kandake an effective rebel leader while showcasing the brutal efficiency that made Rome master of the Mediterranean world. When her sword finally found its mark between her opponent's ribs, the crowd erupted in cheers that transcended national boundaries, appreciation for skill and courage that honored both contestants regardless of their political affiliations. Flavius's combat against his former Roman comrade proved even more emotionally charged, as two friends who had served together in multiple campaigns found themselves facing each other across sand stained with blood and political necessity. The fight was as much about ideology as skill, representing the conflict between loyalty to empire and loyalty to conscience that had torn both men apart since the beginning of their involvement in Kushite affairs. The combat lasted longer than Kandake's encounter, both fighters evenly matched in training and motivation, each seeking to prove through violence the righteousness of choices that could not be resolved through words alone. When Flavius finally emerged victorious, his sword dripping with the blood of a man who had once saved his life during a Germanic campaign, the victory felt more like defeat than vindication. The crowd's reaction was muted, recognizing the tragedy of Roman killing Roman while foreign enemies watched from the stands. Yet both trials by combat had been won by the accused, creating a legal precedent that complicated General Petronius's plans for summary execution of the conspirators. Under Roman law, victory in trial by combat suggested divine approval of the defendant's cause, requiring reconsideration of charges that had seemed ironclad before blood was spilled in the arena.
The unexpected victories in trial by combat created a political crisis that General Petronius had not anticipated, forcing him to choose between strict adherence to Roman legal traditions that favored the defendants and practical considerations that demanded their elimination as threats to imperial authority. The crowd's obvious sympathy for the accused conspirators suggested that execution might create martyrs whose memory would inspire future resistance, while releasing them would seem to endorse unauthorized diplomacy that challenged military command authority. The solution emerged from an unexpected source when Emperor Augustus himself intervened through a message that had been weeks in transit from Rome. The emperor's instructions were characteristically pragmatic: achieve peace in Nubia through whatever means proved most effective, but ensure that imperial dignity and authority remained intact. Armed with this mandate, Petronius announced a revolutionary decision that surprised all observers. Kandake and Flavius would be pardoned for their unauthorized activities and formally appointed as official negotiators, empowered to conclude a comprehensive peace agreement that would end the Kushite rebellion while preserving Roman interests. The announcement transformed traitors into diplomats overnight, validating their risky strategy while demonstrating the empire's flexibility in achieving its objectives through adaptation rather than rigid adherence to military doctrine.
The final peace treaty was signed in the Temple of Amun, where Kushite resistance had been planned, and where reconciliation would now be celebrated with ceremonies that honored both Roman authority and Nubian cultural traditions.
The terms reflected the careful balance that Kandake and Flavius had negotiated through months of secret diplomacy. Rome gained administrative control and regular tribute payments from the gold mines, while Kush retained significant autonomy under imperial oversight and preserved its religious and cultural institutions. Kandake was formally recognized as Queen of Nubia under Roman suzerainty, her authority legitimate within carefully defined boundaries that satisfied imperial requirements while allowing her people to maintain their dignity and identity. Flavius was appointed as imperial procurator, responsible for implementing the transition, his unique understanding of both cultures making him invaluable for ensuring the peace agreement's success. The ceremony concluded with rituals that blended Roman legal formalities with Kushite spiritual traditions, symbolizing the cultural synthesis that would define the region's future under the new arrangement. As the sun set over the Nile and the formal proceedings drew to a close, Kandake found herself standing in the same courtyard where Marcus had been executed months earlier. The irony was not lost on her. Love had led to betrayal and war, but war had ultimately led to understanding and peace. The Roman centurion's death had seemed to end all possibility of reconciliation between their peoples, yet his sacrifice had ultimately made possible the very unity he might have dreamed of achieving through different means. The rivers of gold would continue to flow northward to Rome, but they would no longer be mixed with blood. In the gathering darkness, as Roman and Kushite voices mingled in celebration of hard-won peace, Kandake offered a silent prayer to the gods of both peoples, asking for wisdom to preserve what had been achieved through such terrible cost. The princess who had learned to love and learned to hate had finally learned to forgive, completing a journey that had transformed not just her own heart, but the destiny of two great civilizations whose future now they intertwined along the ancient waters of the Nile.
And that's how love conquered empires and changed the course of history forever. If rivers of gold and blood gave you chills, if you found yourself falling for these star-crossed lovers, if you're craving more epic tales like this, then smash that subscribe button right now. Because next week, I'm dropping the forbidden love story of Cleopatra's secret daughter, a tale so dangerous it was erased from history. The week after that, meet the Viking queen who gave up her throne for love and nearly destroyed 2 kingdoms in the process. Here's what you get as a subscriber: first access to these incredible stories, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and you become part of our community where your story suggestions actually become my next videos. That subscribe button isn't just a click. It's your passport to the most epic, heart-stopping love stories history tried to hide. But before you go, I need to know, Team Kandake or Team Marcus? Did love really conquer all, or was the price too high? Drop your honest thoughts below, because I read every comment and your insights fuel my next stories. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and comment your team below. Because if rivers of gold and blood moved you, trust me, we're just getting started with these legendary love stories. Your next epic adventure is just one click away.